The old rancher only wanted a quiet marriage of convenience, until the trembling young bride stepped out of the wagon, clutching a faded suitcase and hiding a secret that would change both their lives forever. What began as a cold arrangement in the unforgiving West became a love story no one saw coming, filled with betrayal, danger, heartbreak, and a kind of tenderness powerful enough to heal two broken souls. Stay until the very end, because the final twist will leave you speechless. And if you love emotional Western romance stories packed with drama and unforgettable characters, subscribe now and join thousands of viewers who never miss a powerful story of love, redemption, and second chances. The first thing Elijah Turner noticed about the girl standing beside the dusty stagecoach was how small she looked beneath the endless Montana sky. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her thin fingers gripped the handle of a worn leather suitcase as if letting go meant falling apart entirely. The wind tugged at loose strands of chestnut hair escaping her bonnet, and though she tried to stand straight, fear trembled visibly through her posture. Elijah had expected someone older. The marriage broker's letter had promised a practical woman accustomed to hard work, someone seeking stability and willing to help manage a ranch household. Elijah was 38 years old, hardened by years of loss, loneliness, and brutal winters. He wasn't searching for romance. He simply needed help surviving. But the moment the girl lifted her eyes to his, white and uncertain yet strangely determined, something inside him shifted in a way he did not understand. "You're Mr. Turner?" she asked softly. Her voice carried the fragile sweetness of someone who had spent too much time apologizing for existing. Elijah nodded once. "And you're Miss Clara Bennett?" She swallowed nervously. "I suppose, I'm your wife now." The words sounded strange coming from someone so young. Elijah felt guilt settle heavily in his chest. He suddenly became aware of the deep lines on his weathered hands, the gray beginning at his temples, the loneliness that had driven him into making such an arrangement in the first place. People in town already whispered about him. Some said he'd become cold after losing his first wife and infant son during the fever outbreak 10 years earlier. Others claimed he cared more about cattle than human beings. Elijah had stopped defending himself long ago. Pain had a way of silencing a man. He reached for Clara's suitcase, but she hesitated before surrendering it, as though everything she owned in the world rested inside. "You hungry?" he asked awkwardly. She nodded faintly. "A little." That was all either of them said during the wagon ride back to the ranch. Clara sat stiffly beside him while the horses carried them through miles of golden grasslands glowing beneath the setting sun. Elijah noticed how she flinched whenever his arm brushed too close. Not fear of him specifically, he realized. Fear of men in general. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When the ranch house finally appeared in the distance, Clara stared at it with quiet surprise. Though simple, the home stood sturdy against the prairie winds, with white painted fences and lantern light glowing warmly through the windows. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Elijah looked at the house differently then, through her eyes, as if seeing warmth where he'd only seen emptiness before. Inside, Clara moved carefully, thanking him for every little thing. "Thank you for the soup. Thank you for the blanket. Thank you for the room." Elijah wasn't used to gratitude. He certainly wasn't used to someone smiling shyly simply because he pulled out a chair for them. During dinner she barely ate, though her eyes lingered hungrily on the bread. Elijah noticed. Without comment, he sliced another piece and placed it gently on her plate. Clara looked startled by the gesture. Then emotional. "You don't have to ration food here," he said quietly. She lowered her gaze quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. Stop apologizing." The words came out rougher than intended. Clara shrank slightly. Elijah sighed. "I didn't mean it harshly. I just mean, you don't need to be afraid here." Her eyes flickered toward him then, searching his face carefully as though trying to decide whether she could believe him. That night Elijah lay awake longer than usual. He kept thinking about the sadness behind Clara's smile. Girls her age were supposed to laugh easily, dream recklessly, fall in love foolishly. Clara moved like someone who had already endured too much life. Over the following weeks, their strange marriage settled into routine. Clara worked hard despite Elijah repeatedly insisting she rest more. She cleaned the house, helped prepare meals, and even learned to tend chickens despite being terrified of them at first. Slowly, laughter began returning to the ranch. Real laughter. The kind Elijah thought he'd forgotten forever. Clara talked to the horses as if they understood her. She sang softly while hanging laundry. She smiled whenever wildflowers bloomed near the fence line. And each day, Elijah found himself watching her more carefully than he should. Not with desire at first. With protectiveness. She remained skittish around sudden movements. Loud voices startled her. Once, when Elijah accidentally slammed the barn door during a storm, Clara instinctively covered her face as if expecting to be struck. The sight filled him with quiet fury. Someone had taught this girl to fear kindness disappearing without warning. One evening, nearly 2 months after her arrival, Elijah found Clara sitting alone on the porch steps long after dark. Moonlight silvered her face, but tears glistened unmistakably in her eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. She wiped her cheeks quickly. "Nothing." Elijah sat beside her, leaving enough distance not to frighten her. Silence stretched between them before Clara finally whispered, "You ever miss people so badly it hurts to breathe?" Elijah's chest tightened. "Every day." Clara stared toward the horizon. "My mother died when I was 12. After that, my father drank himself mean." Her voice trembled but continued. "When he lost our farm gambling, he started treating me like property. Said marrying me off was the only useful thing left I could do." Elijah felt his jaw harden. "Did he hurt you?" Clara hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Rage unlike anything Elijah had felt in years burned through him, but he kept his voice calm. "He'll never touch you again." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and something vulnerable passed silently between them. Trust beginning to form. Winter arrived early that year. Snow buried the ranch beneath icy white silence while freezing winds rattled windows through the night. Elijah worked tirelessly protecting livestock from brutal storms, and Clara insisted on helping despite the cold. One evening Elijah returned from the barn soaked and exhausted, only to discover Clara asleep in a chair beside the fireplace waiting for him. A book rested open in her lap. Her face looked peaceful in the firelight, softer than he'd ever seen it. Elijah carefully draped a blanket over her shoulders, but Clara stirred awake instantly, panic flashing through her eyes before recognizing him. "Sorry," she murmured. "I wanted to make sure you came back safe." No one had waited up for Elijah in over a decade. The simple statement hit him harder than any confession of love ever could. Their closeness deepened slowly after that. Clara stopped flinching when he touched her hand. Elijah found excuses to remain near her longer than necessary. They shared quiet conversations during snowy evenings, revealing pieces of themselves bit by bit like wounded animals learning trust. Clara admitted she'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher. Elijah confessed he still talked to his dead wife sometimes when loneliness became unbearable. Instead of judgment, Clara only listened with gentle understanding. Yet despite the growing warmth between them, Elijah kept emotional distance where he could. Clara deserved someone younger. Someone untouched by grief. He reminded himself constantly that their marriage began as necessity, nothing more. Then came the night everything changed. A blizzard trapped them inside while fierce winds howled outside the ranch house. Clara had been reading near the fire when thunder cracked violently overhead. Instantly she gasped and dropped the book, panic overtaking her face. Elijah hurried toward her just as Clara stumbled backward, trembling uncontrollably. "Hey, it's all right," he said softly. But she wasn't hearing him. Tears streamed down her cheeks as terror consumed her entirely. "Don't lock me in there again," she cried suddenly. "Please, I'll be good, I promise." Elijah froze. Clara collapsed emotionally before him, revealing wounds far deeper than he imagined. He knelt carefully without touching her. "Clara, look at me." Slowly her panicked gaze lifted toward his. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." She broke then, sobbing with heartbreaking force. Elijah finally gathered her carefully into his arms, half expecting her to recoil. Instead Clara clung to him desperately, burying her face against his chest as years of fear poured out. Elijah held her for a long time beside the fire while the storm raged outside. Something sacred shifted between them that night. Afterward Clara began sleeping peacefully for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Elijah knew because sometimes he'd pause outside her door, listening to silence instead of nightmares. Spring eventually melted winter away, bringing new life across the plains. And with it came trouble. One afternoon Elijah returned from town to find Clara pale and shaken. "Your father came here," she whispered. Instantly Elijah's expression darkened. What did he want? Clara wrapped her arms around herself. Money. Of course. Men like him always wanted something. I told him to leave. Did he hurt you? No. But he said husbands tire of broken girls eventually. Elijah's anger burned cold. That evening he rode straight into town and found Clara's father drunk outside the saloon. The older man smirked when Elijah approached. That girl's nothing but trouble, he slurred. You'll learn. Elijah grabbed him by the collar with terrifying calm. Listen carefully, he said. You ever come near my wife again, I'll make sure you regret it. Clara's father sneered. Wife. You bought her same as anyone would buy cattle. Elijah released him suddenly, disgusted. No, he said quietly. I gave her a home. There's a difference. When Elijah returned to the ranch, Clara waited anxiously on the porch. What happened? She asked. He won't bother you again. Relief flooded her face so powerfully Elijah realized no one had ever truly protected her before. Not once in her life. That realization broke something open inside him completely. Weeks later, during a town gathering, Elijah overheard cruel whispers from other ranchers' wives. Poor thing. Married off to an old widower. She probably shares his bed out of obligation. Elijah saw humiliation wash over Clara's face before she hurried outside. He followed immediately, finding her standing alone behind the church struggling not to cry. They're wrong, he said firmly. Clara gave a sad little laugh. Are they? Elijah stepped closer carefully. I've never touched you because I wanted you to choose your life freely. Not because you owed me. Clara stared at him in stunned silence. You mean that? Every word. Tears filled her eyes again, but different tears this time. Softer ones. No man's ever cared what I wanted before. Elijah's chest tightened painfully. Before he could stop himself, he brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Clara didn't pull away. Instead she leaned ever so slightly into his touch. The world seemed to still around them. Elijah, she whispered. He kissed her then, gently, slowly, as though afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. Clara's hand trembled against his chest, but she kissed him back with quiet tenderness that nearly undid him entirely. When they finally separated, Clara rested her forehead against his. I was afraid I'd never know what real kindness felt like, she admitted softly. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. And I thought love died with my first wife. Clara smiled through tears. Maybe love just changes shape. Their marriage transformed after that night. Not suddenly, but beautifully. Elijah learned Clara loved dancing badly in the kitchen when no one watched. Clara learned Elijah secretly carved wooden animals whenever stress overwhelmed him. They became partners in every sense, not through obligation, but choice. For the first time in years, Elijah laughed easily again. For the first time in her life, Clara felt safe. But happiness rarely arrives without challenge. One summer evening Clara fainted while working outside. Terrified, Elijah carried her inside and summoned the doctor immediately. Hours later the doctor emerged smiling knowingly. Congratulations, he said. Your wife is expecting. Elijah stood speechless. A child. After all the loss, all the years believing fatherhood had been buried with his infant son, life was offering him another chance. When he entered the bedroom, Clara looked terrified rather than happy. You don't have to pretend excitement, she whispered shakily. I know this wasn't planned. Elijah crossed the room immediately and knelt beside her. Clara, look at me. Slowly she did. This child is already loved. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Really? Elijah kissed her hand. More than you know. Pregnancy changed Clara in beautiful ways. Joy softened the lingering sadness in her eyes. She laughed more. Dreamed aloud about baby names. Yet fear remained too. Some nights Elijah woke to find her quietly crying beside him. What if I become my father? She whispered once. Elijah pulled her close carefully. You are nothing like him. How can you be sure? Because cruel people never worry about becoming cruel. Clara held onto those words fiercely afterward. As months passed, Elijah became absurdly protective. He forbade Clara from lifting anything heavy, which she hated. He followed her around constantly whenever storms approached. Once he nearly panicked because she climbed a small ladder alone. Clara teased him endlessly for it. You realize women have survived childbirth before, right? Elijah grumbled. Doesn't mean I have to like the risks. Then tragedy nearly struck again. Late one evening while Elijah handled business in town, Clara went into premature labor during a violent storm. By the time Elijah returned, the doctor had already arrived. Clara's screams shattered him. Hours dragged by in unbearable fear as memories of losing his first wife threatened consuming him entirely. When the doctor finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, Elijah nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a daughter," he announced. Elijah entered the bedroom, trembling. Clara looked pale and exhausted, but alive. Alive. In her arms rested the tiniest little girl Elijah had ever seen. "Meet Emma," Clara whispered weakly. Elijah stared at his daughter with overwhelming emotion clogging his throat. Emma's tiny fingers curled instinctively around one of his. In that moment, something long dead inside him came fully back to life. "She has your eyes," Clara murmured. Elijah looked at his wife then, the frightened girl who arrived months ago believing herself unwanted, who somehow taught a broken man how to love again simply by existing gently in a cruel world. He kissed her forehead carefully. "No," he said quietly. "She has your heart." Years later, people in town would still talk about the strange marriage that unexpectedly became the greatest love story in the territory. They spoke of how Elijah Turner transformed from a cold widower into the kind of father who carried flowers home for his wife every Sunday after church. They spoke of Clara, whose warmth turned even the harshest ranch hands soft around children. And they spoke of the way Elijah still looked at Clara after all those years. Not like a man who rescued her, but like a man forever grateful she rescued him too. Because in the end, Clara's innocence had never been weakness. It had been the rare courage to remain gentle in a world determined to make her hard. And Elijah learned the greatest love wasn't built on passion alone. It was built on safety, trust, kindness, the quiet choice to protect another person's heart as carefully as your own. On warm summer evenings, Elijah sometimes sat on the porch watching Clara chase Emma through fields of wildflowers while laughter carried across the prairie wind. And every single time, he silently thanked God for the frightened young bride he never expected, the one who taught him love could still bloom even after the harshest winters of the soul.